Dwight Eisenhower stood in front of crowds and looked like the kind of man who never panics. He had a face people trusted in storms, and he could talk about war without sounding hungry for it. Because he was Ike, people wanted his family story to match the legend. They wanted to believe his ancestors ran for their lives out of Germany in 1741, chased by persecution and escaping at the last second. It makes for a great movie, but if you believe that version, you miss the real source of his strength. The truth isn't a chase scene, it is a long, risky gamble. Eisenhower's ancestors did not flee Germany due to immediate persecution. They migrated as part of a massive wave of German Palatine immigrants moving to Pennsylvania. It wasn't one family sprinting from danger. It was thousands moving for the same hard reasons: land, work, and a chance to breathe. They were ordinary people making an extraordinary choice. His story begins with a surname that already tells you what kind of labor sat behind it. In German, Eisen means iron, and hauen means to hew or cut. Eisenhower translates to iron hewer, someone who breaks iron ore or works around mines. It's a name that sounds like sparks and heavy tools. It doesn't guarantee the exact job of one person, but it points to an origin in the mining areas around Karlsbrunn. It says, our people worked. The man who started the American chapter was Hans Nicholas Eisenhower. In late 1741, he boarded the ship Europa in Rotterdam and sailed for Philadelphia. He wasn't running from a villain banging on his door. He was leaving a region crushed by the aftershocks of war, population pressure on small farms, and the looming threat of military drafts. The problem was a life that was slowly closing in. The choice was to get on a boat. The consequence was a new life in Pennsylvania. That migration wasn't about panic, it was about control. Hans Nicholas wanted land he could keep and a life where his sons weren't forced into wars he didn't choose. Later, the family settled into farming, trading the ironwork for the soil. This matters because Dwight Eisenhower didn't inherit a history of frantic escapes. He inherited a history of calculated risks. His ancestors were people who lived close to pressure and kept moving anyway. But the steady, calm president we remember wasn't shaped by centuries of stability. He was shaped by a sudden, devastating collapse. The Eisenhowers didn't start in Kansas as poor dreamers. They came from relative prosperity as Pennsylvania, Dutch farmers in Lancaster County. They had land, which meant they had a future. Then, in 1878, Dwight's grandfather, Jacob Frederick Eisenhower, led the family west to Kansas in search of better soil. That was the gamble. Then came the crash. Dwight's father, David, opened a general store in Hope, Kansas, with a partner. A general store in a small town is everything. It's where people buy what they need, but it's also where credit gets tested. Around 1887, the store failed. It wasn't a dramatic robbery. It was poor management and extending credit to people who couldn't pay during a downturn. The failure swept the family's legs out from under them. They lost the business and fell into poverty. They moved to Texas, tried to start over, and failed again. In 1892, the family returned to Kansas with only $24, not $24 in their pocket for a rainy day, $24 as the total sum for a household with 6 surviving sons. This is the moment that made Dwight Eisenhower. He wasn't born into the steady comfort of a farm. He was born into the terrifying reset of a family that had lost its footing. He grew up in the shadow of that failure. He watched his father, David, take a job as a mechanic at the Bell Springs Creamery. It was a River Brethren cooperative, and the work was brutal. David worked over 60 hours a week for low wages just to keep the boys fed. Dwight didn't learn about hard work from books. He He learned it by watching his father come home with tired hands week after week. The family lived in a small house in Abilene that they bought from a relative, achieving basic stability but never regaining their wealth. They were working class poor. That means you have a roof, but you also have a garden because you need the food. You wear hand-me-downs because new clothes are a waste. If you grow up like that, you don't romanticize risk. You build systems to prevent disaster. You learn that one bad decision with credit can destroy years of work. Eisenhower's famous calm wasn't just a personality trait. It was survival training. It was the instinct of a man who knew exactly how fast the floor could drop out. The house in Abilene was crowded, loud, and competitive. Dwight was one of 7 boys. In a house that small with that many sons, nothing is given to you. You have to win your space. The boys fought over everything: food, attention, respect. They played sports like their lives depended on it because in that house, a win was the only way to get standing. But the rivalry hid a fierce loyalty. There is a story about Dwight that stops you cold. He once suffered a severe knee infection that became life-threatening. The pain was so bad and the delirium so high that he threatened to cut off his own leg. It wasn't a joke, it was a crisis, and his brothers physically guarded him to stop him from doing it. That is the Eisenhower dynamic in one scene. They fought each other, but they protected each other when the threat was real. They didn't just comfort him, they stopped him from destroying himself. That mix of sharp competition and absolute backup is where he learned to lead. He learned that you can argue and fight, but you stay on the same team. Poverty also shaped his ambition. His brother Edgar wanted to go to college, but there wasn't enough money. So Dwight made a choice. He worked at the creamery to pay for Edgar's education, delaying his own path. He put his brother first. When his turn came, he looked for a school that wouldn't bankrupt the family. He found West Point. He didn't choose the military just for glory. He chose it because the education was free. It was a practical solution to a math problem his father's store failure had created. But that choice triggered a conflict that cut deep into the family's soul. In 1911, when Dwight decided to go to West Point, he was walking straight toward the one thing his mother hated most. Ida Stover Eisenhower was a woman of steel and faith. She was raised in a pacifist River Brethren household in Virginia, where the memories of the Civil War were fresh and painful. Her parents' early deaths were linked to the hardships of that war. To Ida, war wasn't a game or a career, it was wicked. She believed killing was a sin against God, a belief reinforced when she later joined the Bible Students, the group that became Jehovah's Witnesses. From 1896 to 1915, the Eisenhower living room was a meeting place for Bible students. Dwight grew up hearing that war was evil and that a true believer refused to fight. He lived in a home where nonviolence was the law. Then, he told his mother he was leaving to become a soldier. Ida didn't scream. She didn't throw him out. She called warfare rather wicked, but she did not overrule him. She had a conviction that was absolute, but she also respected his right to choose his own path. She let him go. That tension, a son commanding armies while his mother prayed for peace, is the hidden engine of his life. He wasn't raised by a drill sergeant. He was raised by a pacifist who taught him that authority requires self-control. This religious background created a puzzle that confused people for decades. Dwight Eisenhower was a man who eventually led the free world. Yet for 37 years of his military career, he never joined a church. It wasn't because he didn't believe. It was because he believed in a specific way. He grew up in a tradition where baptism was voluntary. You didn't get baptized because you were born. You did it when you chose it. That taught him that faith was a private transaction between a person and God. As a soldier, he moved constantly. A church building couldn't travel with him, but his Bible and his prayer habit could. He considered himself deeply religious, but he avoided the labels and the sects. Then he became president. Suddenly, private faith wasn't enough. The country in the 1950s was worried about secularism and wanted a moral leader. Eisenhower faced a choice. He could keep his faith hidden, or he could make a public gesture to reassure the nation. In 1953, at age 62, the President of the United States was baptized and joined the National Presbyterian Church. He didn't do it because he suddenly found God. He did it because he felt a duty to set an example. He formalized the faith he had carried in his pocket for 40 years. It wasn't hypocrisy. It was the final act of a man who understood that sometimes you have to wear a uniform, even a spiritual one, to lead effectively. When you look at Eisenhower, it's easy to group him with other leaders of his time, like Franklin D. Roosevelt. They both led the world through war. They both seem like giants of history. But if you look at where they started, you see two completely different Americas. FDR was born on a 600-acre estate in New York. He had servants, European travel, and a Harvard education. He was American royalty. Eisenhower was born on the wrong side of the tracks, in Abilene. FDR's family had been elite since 1649. Eisenhower's family was working-class poor, counting every penny after the store collapsed. FDR learned leadership because he was raised to believe it was his birthright. Eisenhower learned leadership because he had to organize 6 brothers to get the chores done. FDR was tested by polio, a disease that ravaged his body and taught him grit. Eisenhower was tested by poverty, a condition that ravaged his family's security and taught him discipline. The fact that they both ended up at the top is the story of the war itself. It required both kinds of strength. It needed the confidence of a man who owned the land and the toughness of a man who had to plow it. By the time Dwight was a general, he looked like the quintessential American. He seemed to have no accent, no ethnic baggage, just plain Kansas common sense. But that identity was an invention. It was the result of a ruthless 3-generation sprint to assimilate. His grandfather Jacob spoke German. The family in Pennsylvania was part of a German-speaking enclave that had stayed separate for over a century. But when they moved to Kansas in 1878, they made a choice. They didn't build a little Germany on the plains. They dissolved into the English-speaking world. They changed the spelling of the name from Eisenhower to Eisenhower to make it easier for English speakers. They sent the boys to public schools where English was the only option. They married outside the tight German circle. In just 1 generation, they went from German-speaking farmers to English-speaking creamery workers who played baseball. This wasn't an accident. It was a survival strategy. In a country that was changing fast, the Eisenhowers decided that the best way to secure a future was to become invisible within the mainstream. Dwight didn't have to struggle to fit in because his parents and grandparents had already done the hard work of blending in. He inherited an identity that was already polished and ready for the national stage. So when you see the picture of Dwight Eisenhower, the bald head, the wide grin, the steady eyes, don't just see a general. See the history that built him. See the ancestors who boarded the Europa not to flee, but to build. See the father who lost a store and worked himself to the bone at a creamery to restart. See the $24 that stood between the family and ruin. See the mother who hated war, but loved her son enough to let him fight. Eisenhower wasn't a man of simple calm. He was a man of engineered stability. He knew what it felt like when the money ran out. He knew what it felt like to be sick and desperate. He knew what it felt like to disagree with the people you loved most. He took all that chaos and forged it into the iron will that won a war and led a nation. He didn't just happen to be tough. He was an Eisenhower. He was hewn from it.